You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth!
Our next Canadian speaker, Wally Dove, has been a certified general accountant for 26 years. 13 years of that time was spent working with Revenue Canada and its provincial counterpart. He'll tell you his observations and experiences, and explain the facts of life as far as Canadian tax law is concerned, and how the public has been misled about its own laws and rights.
By the end of this presentation, I feel very confident that you'll be aware of probably three things: that income tax is unlawful in Canada, in probably every province except Quebec. Tax is also for the benefit of the bankers, and the Government of Canada has no lawful authority to even exist. Those are three things that you may be comfortable with by the end of this presentation. And throughout this presentation, I will undoubtedly be using the term CCRA and Revenue Canada interchangeably, because CCRA is a recent change that was made, and Revenue Canada was its predecessor and the organization that I worked for. Today, that organization is known as Canada Customs and Revenue Agency, or CCRA. And during my career with Revenue Canada, I worked as an auditor, a collector, and a special investigator. It was during this period of time that I witnessed some acts and treatment of Canadians that caused me to literally become ill. I could not function in such an environment, and to be party to the types of things that I was required to do, I simply could not do that. I missed a lot of work as a result, and I was continuously at odds with my employer. What I have witnessed and learned since leaving Revenue Canada has simply confirmed the existence of a plan of genocide against the people of Canada by special interest groups that I will refer to as the oligarchy. Some refer to them as the international bankers. They exist, and they are attempting to subjugate the entire world to a one-world dictatorship known as the One World Government, or the New World Order. This is a small group of families and individuals who work behind the scenes to control our government and manipulate its actions in order to commit genocide against the people of Canada. In addition to genocide, we're talking about theft of the wealth of all Canadians and the enslavement of all Canadians. My purpose in life at this time is to save my government from this maniacal oligarchy and once again gain control over the people's creation, which is the Government of Canada. I will state my position very clearly from the start, that our government is not the problem. They are but tools in the implementation of the oligarchs' plans to rule the entire world via the One World Government, or unelected dictatorship. If any of you think that you have nothing to worry about if you keep your hands clean, quote-unquote, and obey the law and pay your taxes, I have news for you. I will begin by relating an incident to you that is but the mere tip of the iceberg as regards such incidents across the country today. There are literally thousands of similar incidents, and there are many within CCRA, the successor of Revenue Canada, the federal tax collection agency, who are proud to have caused such devastation in the lives of Canadians. I speak with authority on this issue because I have been there and I know some of these people. At this point, I would like to say that it was during a long car ride in British Columbia recently with a friend that I was convinced of the importance of relating some of my experiences with Revenue Canada to the people of this country. Prior to that, I would not talk about it simply because it was too painful for me, at least. Once Debbie convinced me to talk about my experiences and what Revenue Canada was doing to the people of this country, I decided to listen and commenced to relate my experiences to the audiences during our seminars. At first, it was very difficult for me. I would be on the verge of tears most of the time. I likened it to someone who had been involved in a war and killed someone. They, too, were very reluctant to talk about their experiences. However, as time went on, I found it a little easier to talk about these things. At any rate, the incident that I want to relate concerns a family from Cardston, Alberta. The Stefan family, Deborah, Tony, and their 8 children, thought they were safe and secure in one of the greatest countries on earth. The Stefans had always filed their tax returns and paid their taxes, and everything was fine as far as they were concerned. They had nothing to worry about. After all, they were law-abiding citizens and had nothing to fear. Then Revenue Canada decided that things were not so fine and that Tony owed them some $29,000 in taxes. The amount does not matter, and whether they owed it or not does not matter either, although Tony says to this day that they did not owe the money. So what matters is what happened next. What happened next, I can testify to from personal experience, is typical. It was the reason that I was constantly in trouble or at odds with my superiors when I worked at Revenue Canada. I was unable to do the things required of me. I wanted to treat people with respect, and I was not willing to collect taxes at any cost. I just could not do that. At any rate, the story goes something like this. In September of 1993, this large family was struggling under severe financial hardship with a number of creditors. With the exception of Revenue Canada, all creditors had indicated a willingness to wait and work with the family until the financial situation improved. Mr. and Mrs. Stefan were committed to paying their debts and avoiding bankruptcy. As can be shown in the Revenue Canada Access Diary, that's a diary that's maintained on most Canadians concerning their activity with Revenue Canada, the agents involved were well aware of the family's hardships and the situation, but continued to press the family into an even more difficult situation. The family had to receive support from Alberta Social Services to assist, as Mr. and Mrs. Stefan attempted to provide sufficient income for their children. Often there was little food for the children. Both Mr. and Mrs. Stefan had agreed to pay down the debt owing to Revenue Canada with their RSPs. This was a voluntary act of cooperation, as Revenue Canada could not legally take the RSPs, at least at that time. Therefore, the Stefans exhibited cooperation in attempting to pay the assessment. They even sold the only means of transportation that they had and provided the proceeds to Revenue Canada. On January the 11th, 1994, Revenue Canada agents issued a garnishee against the family income. The total income for that month was only $967, from which a $1,000 mortgage payment was due. This kind of extreme pressure continued, and the agents, in order to satisfy their own ambitions and their superiors, were relentless. They literally made it impossible for the Stefans to even provide food for the family. Then one cold, wintry day, Debbie drove to a park and took her own life. She left a note for her husband, instructing him to take her insurance proceeds in order to pay Revenue Canada so that her children would not have to live on the streets. These public servants knowingly violated sections of the Canadian Bill of Rights, subsection 2B, the Charter of Rights, 7 and 8, Taxation Policy 2253.51 and Section 5-A-3 and 4 of the Integrated Collections Handbook, and are guilty of breach of trust under Section 122 of the Canadian Criminal Code. That's all pretty clear. Mr. Stefan remembers hearing his wife cry, wondering if Revenue Canada would soon have the family on the street with no housing. Certainly these officious agents broke the law and demonstrated their lack of compassion for this Canadian family. After her death, Mr. Stefan sought copies of the departmental policies relating to families experiencing financial hardship. He was told by senior management that policies such as these were non-existent. When pressed further in May of 1996, Revenue Canada raised a fraudulent reassessment against Mr. Stefan and forced him into bankruptcy. Mr. Stefan then repaid all of his creditors with the exception of the false reassessment. This travesty of justice that was enacted against the Stefan family was a clear plan of attack and a repugnant abuse. Then, to add insult to injury, on August 21, 1999, Revenue Canada reassessed the late Debbie Stefan. This case demonstrates the absolute callousness of these agents, and further should cause you all great concern. After all, did Debbie and Tony not file their tax returns and pay their taxes? As I said, this incident is one of many that occur daily in Canada. I am reminded of the incident in 2001 in Okotoks, Alberta, where a man set his house on fire and would not come out continuing to yell that Revenue Canada would never get his house, and he burned to death rather than to see that injustice takes place. I recall many incidents when I was with Revenue Canada of hearing other employees brag about how they had caused a bankruptcy, or had someone eating dog food, or had caused a suicide, and instead of being remorseful about it, they were extremely proud of it. I recall many times becoming literally ill over this kind of thing. I remember thinking that I was just not cut out for this job. I recall many times how these people were being promoted, and I was not. At that time, I did not even relate their promotions to their willingness to do what it took to obtain reassessments and collect money. Their rewards, I realize today, were directly related to the callousness with which they did their jobs. I used to think it was because I was not good at taking tests or examinations or doing interviews and things like that. There was one more reason that we all need to worry about what is happening in Canada with the fraudulent activity concerning taxation and the monetary and banking systems, and that is this. When Henry Kissinger was the U.S. ambassador to the UN, he was reportedly instrumental in having the UN pass a resolution stating that the sustainable population of the Earth is some 2 billion. By my calculation, that means that if there are 6 of you listening to this CD, then 4 of you are targeted for elimination. Now let me turn to the topic of this discussion, and that is the history and evolution of taxation in Canada. I will not get too involved in the history preceding the year 1867, but suffice it to say that there is ample evidence to show that Britain was concerned that British North America, that is Canada, would fall into the hands of the Americans or some other foreign power, and therefore decided to cause or force the uniting of Upper and Lower Canada with a view to bringing the entire country together eventually. The evidence further discloses that the people did not want this union, particularly Nova Scotians who voted not to join in this confederation. However, despite all opposition, Britain finally passed and enacted the British North America Act and established a dictatorship under a dictator known as the Governor-General of Canada, who took advice from the Dominion Parliament. Therefore, it should be understood that Canada has never had a constitution. What we had was an act of the Imperial Parliament of Great Britain, and what we have now is the same document referred to as the Constitution Act of 1982. The BNA Act, currently the Constitution Act 1867 to 1982, allocated the powers of the 2 levels of government referred to as the legislatures, or provinces, and the Parliament, the federal government. These powers were defined and outlined in 2 separate sections of the BNA Act. First, there is Section 91, wherein the powers of the Parliament, or the federal government, were outlined. Then there is Section 92, wherein the powers of the legislatures, or provinces, are outlined. It is a recorded fact that Section 92 was written first, followed by Section 91, which in fact could have been left out because it is residual in nature. In other words, the provincial powers were listed first in Section 92, and the federal government, or Parliament, got the remainder. In the case Nova Scotia Attorney General versus Canada Attorney General, 1951, the Supreme Court of Canada, on October the 3rd, said this: "The Parliament of Canada and each provincial legislature is a sovereign body within its sphere, possessed of exclusive jurisdiction to legislate with regard to the subject matters assigned to it under Section 91 or Section 92, as the case may be. Neither is capable, therefore, of delegating to the other the powers with which it has been invested, nor of receiving from the other the powers with which the other has been vested." The court went on to say this: "The Parliament of Canada and the legislatures of the several provinces are sovereign within their sphere, defined by the British North America Act, but none of them has the unlimited capacity of an individual. They can exercise only the legislative powers respectively given to them by Sections 91 and 92 of the Act, and these powers must be found in either of these sections." The court went on to say the Constitution of Canada does not belong either to Parliament or to the legislatures. It belongs to the country, and it is there that the citizens of the country will find the protection of the rights to which they are entitled. It is part of that protection that Parliament can legislate only on the subject matters referred to it by Section 91, and that each province can legislate exclusively on the subject matters referred to it by Section 92. Now, this is the Supreme Court of Canada ruling of 1951. And what this means is that if either level of government has any power, it is granted them by either Sections 91 or 92 of the BNA Act, or what is referred to as the Constitution Act of today. It also means that if the provinces have a power such as direct taxation, then they cannot give this power to the federal government, as they have in every province in Canada except Quebec, which collects its own income tax. Thus, this means that income tax, even provincial tax, in all provinces except Quebec is illegal because of the tax collection agreements between the provinces and the federal government. Legal means written someplace. Unlawful means it does not have lawful authority. So the income tax of Canada does not have lawful authority, not sanctioned, therefore, by the so-called Constitution. The last paragraph means that we should be able to find protection in our so-called Constitution, but I'm afraid that we cannot. The courts are all currently operating under admiralty or maritime jurisdiction, meaning that when we enter the court, we are in a court-martial type of proceeding where we have no rights and there is no Constitution. This situation has been accomplished by the introduction of the Uniform Commercial Code, UCC, whose equivalent in Canada is the Bills of Exchange Act. The UCC is an international act which applies to the United States and many other countries. The Bills of Exchange Act in Canada is the equivalent, and it represents Roman law and can be traced back to Babylon. Therefore, we are under Roman law, and the courts are operating under admiralty jurisdiction, with the actual supreme law of the land being the Bills of Exchange Act, and suspension of the Constitution has therefore been accomplished. At this point, it might be wise to define direct taxation before we move on in our discussion. Direct taxation was addressed by the court in the Bank of Toronto versus Lamb case of 1887, when the court said this: "This decision of the Judicial Committee is the most important pronouncement of a court on the meaning of the words just quoted. It has, in effect, incorporated into the law the following words of the English economist John Stuart Mill as to the distinction between direct and indirect taxes. His statement was this: taxes are either direct or indirect. A direct tax is one which is demanded from the very person who it is intended or desired should pay it. Indirect taxes are those which are demanded from one person in the expectation and intention that he shall indemnify himself at the expense of another. Such are the excise or customs. Therefore, income tax and arguably the GST are both direct taxes. GST replaced the former excise tax, commonly known as the manufacturer's sales tax. So let's see what the BNA Act, which I will hereinafter refer to as the Constitution Act, says about direct taxation. First, let's look at the provincial powers in Section 92 of the Constitution Act and see what that section has to say regarding taxation. Section 92 of the Act gives the exclusive power to direct taxation to the provincial legislatures. Subsection 2 thereof reads, "Direct taxation within the province in order to the raising of a revenue for provincial purposes." Section 91 of the Act gives the remainder of the taxation powers to the federal government. Subsection 3 thereof reads, "The raising of money by any mode or system of taxation." These statements are proven by the preamble to Section 91, which states in part, "It shall be lawful for the Queen, and with the advice and consent of the Senate and House of Commons, to make laws for the peace, order, and good government of Canada in relation to all matters not coming within the classes of subjects by this Act assigned exclusively to the legislatures of the provinces." Unquote. As is obvious to anyone even a bureaucrat. This means that since direct taxation is the exclusive power of the provinces, the federal government has no power to legislate in relation to it. That is, income tax and GST, unless one has a problem comprehending what the word exclusively means. However, in the event that one is a politician, the framers of the Act made this statement a second time to clarify. Subsection 91 brackets 29 states as follows: such classes of subjects as are expressly accepted in the enumeration of the classes of subjects by this Act assigned exclusively to the legislatures of the provinces. In other words, if a power is not included in the provincial powers listed in Section 92, then it becomes a federal power. This was elaborated on in the Bank of Toronto v. Lamb case of 1887, when the court said, "Their lordships have to construe the express words of an Act of Parliament which makes an elaborate distribution of the whole field of legislative authority between two legislative bodies." In this case, of course, they would be referring to the federal and provincial governments, and at the same time provides for the federated provinces a carefully balanced constitution, under which no one of the parts can pass laws for itself except under the control of the whole acting through the Governor-General. And the question they have to answer is whether the one body or the other has power to make a given law. If they find that on the due construction of the Act, a legislative power falls within Section 92, it would be quite wrong of them to deny its existence because of some possibility it may be abused, or may limit the range which otherwise would be open to the Dominion Parliament." Unquote. Now, further, in the event that one totally lacks comprehension, such as possibly is the case with lawyers and judges these days, based on my personal experience anyway, the framers of the Act stated it one more time in the post-amble to Section 91, Federal Powers. Using different wording, it states this: "And any matter coming within any of the classes of subjects enumerated in this section shall not be deemed to come within the classes of matters of a local or private nature comprised in the enumeration of the classes of subjects by this Act assigned exclusively to the legislatures of the provinces." So it's very clear, 3 times in Section 91, the framers of that Act tried to get the message through to all of us that if any power was assigned to the provinces under Section 92, they were both exclusive and not to be considered or encroached upon by the federal government, and not to be included in Section 91. Their powers, in other words. If this were not enough, I quote from a speech by Lord Carnarvon, one of the framers of the British North America Act, currently the Constitution Act. During its introduction in the British House of Lords on February the 19th, 1867, Lord Carnarvon said this: "The several provinces which are now free to raise a revenue as they may think fit, surrender to the central Parliament all powers under this head except that of direct taxation." He not only said that, he said it twice. Later on in the same speech, he says, "As I have said, it is proposed that the provinces shall surrender to the central Parliament all powers of raising revenue except by direct taxation. Therefore, the power of direct taxation has never been surrendered by the provinces to the federal government." To suggest that these words could have a different meaning today than in 1867 is not only deception, it is bordering on insanity. Yet that is exactly what we are being told, and we are expected to accept from our bureaucrats and politicians and our judges. To continue, on July the 26th, 1894, the British House of Lords was debating a finance bill, number 163. During the second reading, the Earl of Faversham stated, "In the Imperial Act by which they enable the provinces of North America to federate into one Dominion in 1867, the Dominion government by the Imperial Act was expressly forbidden levying any direct taxes, and that prerogative of taxation was expressly reserved to the provincial governments." Then in a letter from Sir Charles Tupper, the High Commissioner for Canada, to the Colonial Office, dated June the 30th, 1894, and received on July the 2nd, 1894, it states, "So far as Canada is concerned, the case is even stronger than in the other colonies, as, under the Confederation Act, passed by the Imperial Parliament in 1867, the power of imposing taxation of this description, that is, estate duties, a direct tax, was exclusively assigned to the local governments and legislatures of the provinces of the Dominion, for the purpose of enabling them to provide the revenue required to carry on the administration of local affairs." At this time, I should say that it makes perfect sense if one thinks about it, that taxes raised by a provincial government are spent within the province and not spent internationally. So it's okay, theoretically, to tax the citizens of a province if the provincial government does it. Other than that, the citizens of Canada should never be asked to give money to a federal government because it's spent internationally. And that is to come from the natural resources of the country and businesses. During the House of Commons debate on March the 18th, 1952, Mr. Drew states as follows, "I said that there were different methods, but the method that I prefer, and I have indicated for a long time, is for the Dominion government to get out of the fields that they invaded and to let the provinces have the tax resources that will permit them to raise the taxes for the things they are called upon to do. This Dominion government today is a trespasser in the field of provincial taxes. They have not carried out their promise to vacate the tax fields they entered during the war, and they are doing nothing to make it possible for new arrangements to be made on a satisfactory basis." Later in the same debate, Mr. Drew stated, "In this whole problem, it seems to me that the time has come to recognize that the inability of the provinces to meet the need for increased payments for education is simply an incident of the continued and deliberate evasion by the Dominion government of its solemn obligation to vacate those tax fields it entered during the last war, and to find some satisfactory basis of taxation which will give to the provincial governments not only financial capacity to meet their requirement, but the real responsibility for those things which are exclusively within their field." Then in the Lord Nelson Hotel case of 1950, the Supreme Court of Canada confirmed the decision of the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia and stated that Parliament could not delegate its powers to the provincial legislatures, nor could the provincial legislatures delegate its powers to Parliament. Therefore, the tax rental collection agreements that exist between the provinces, except Quebec, who got it right, and the federal government are all ultra vires, that is, not within the powers of the Constitution Act and the powers assigned thereunder to the federal government. Now that we have a definition of direct taxation, and it includes income tax, and we know that direct taxation is the exclusive jurisdiction of the provinces, it begs the question, why do we have a federal income tax, or even a GST? In fact, why do we have any taxation? Let me just expand upon this for a moment. If the people own the country and all its wealth, and the government is our trustee, being entrusted with the control and management of our wealth or natural resources, where is our money? For about 150 years now, the government has been managing our wealth and the corporations extracting and manipulating them. There must be some money left over. At least it begs the question, why are we paying anything to the government when they have all the wealth and money, holding it in trust for us? The fact is, and it is a self-evident truth, that the government owes us and should be paying us annually. Instead, we labor to the point of exhaustion in order to create wealth for the international bankers who actually control our government and our resources, and yes, they control us as well. The Federal Income Tax Act was introduced in 1917. The express purpose, at least what Canadians were told the purpose was in order to pay the cost of the First World War. In subsequent parliamentary debates, the question was asked why we still have a federal income tax when the cost of the war was paid off in 1929. The question reveals that there is a hidden agenda and that the Federal Income Tax Act has nothing to do with the express purpose for its introduction. The real reason the Federal Income Tax Act was introduced in 1917 was in order to service a national debt that was growing at enormous and unprecedented rates due to the introduction of the Bank Act of 1913. This act, either by acquiescence or by the statute itself, gave the power to create money and control credit to the private banks. This, too, in accordance with the Supreme Court decision of 1950, is ultra vires the powers of Parliament. I hope you can now see that the real problem is not your government, it is the money changers, the international bankers, the Rothschilds and Warburgs, and yes, the Rockefellers. You see, the purpose of taxation of all kinds, and even the courts and license fees, speeding tickets, and the like, parking tickets, is all designed to take the bank's unlawful and debauched fiat currency out of circulation and return it to its creator, the banks. Once you cut through all the smoke and mirrors, that is what you come up with. Some of you may find it rather unbelievable that the private banks actually create all of our money out of nothing, loaning it to us at interest, and we are required to pay this money and the interest back to the banks who created it. The overwhelming evidence of the truth of this statement is contained in the minutes of proceedings of the Standing Committee on Banking and Commerce held on March the 8th and 16th of 1939. Witnesses that were called during these proceedings were Dr. W.C. Clark, Deputy Minister of Finance, and Mr. Graham Ford Towers, Governor of the Bank of Canada. At one point, Mr. Towers was asked this question: Mr. Towers, when you allow the merchant banking system to issue bank deposits, which, with the practice of using the checks as we have it in vogue today, constitutes the medium of exchange upon which I think 95%, at that time there was a 5% reserve requirement which was eliminated by Mulrooney in 1991. Now the banks are required to have no reserves and are totally unlimited in the amount of money that they can create. I continue with the quote. I think 95% of our public and private business is transacted. You virtually allow the banks to issue an effective substitute for money, do you not? And Mr. Towers' answer is most revealing. He replied, the bank deposits are actually money in that sense, yes. This kind of exchange continues throughout 854 pages of minutes that I have in my possession. Therefore, I trust that you can see the relationship between taxation and the fiat currency money system that we have in existence today. If the government was issuing our money, as they are required to do by the Constitution Act, then we would have no taxation whatsoever at the federal level, other than taxation of corporations on the extraction and use of our natural resources, or our wealth. This wealth would then be turned over to us, minus that portion which the government used to provide the services to us that we authorized. Now let me discuss some more interesting facts. Let's talk about the government itself. I will not take you through the entire history of the government, simply enough to establish one fact. The government of Canada has no lawful authority to exist, and as such, it is a criminal organization, and will remain so until authorized by the people of Canada by their writing and acceptance of a constitution. The Government of Canada, aside from being a criminal organization having no lawful authority to exist, is nothing more than a puppet government operated by the oligarchy. That is a government of a few families totaling about 13 in number. Every law that is passed in this country today is ordered by the Privy Council, who in turn takes its orders from the oligarchy. This simply means that we are being governed by a foreign, hidden, and unelected governmental dictatorship. To demonstrate that the Canadian government is a criminal organization, let me take you through a few publicly recorded and available facts to prove it. Under the Constitution Act 1982, Section 52, subsection 1 states, and I quote, "The Constitution of Canada is the supreme law of Canada, and any law that is inconsistent with the provisions of the Constitution is, to the extent of that inconsistency, of no force or effect." Under the Constitution Act, Section 2 states, and I quote, The provisions of this act referring to Her Majesty the Queen extend also to the heirs and successors of Her Majesty, kings and queens of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And it says this: "Be it known that Section 2 of the British North America Act 1867 was repealed by the Statute Law Revision Act 1893, and the power of the Crown was thereby transferred to the Lord High Chancellor of England in Chancery, and that the Home Office contained that branch called the Colonial Office." Sir Charles Schuster, Clerk of the Crown in Chancery by warrant under the King's Sign Manual on the 23rd of March 1931, was the person who signed the last valid and lawful Canada letters patent under the Great Seal of the realm constituting the office of Governor-General and Commander-in-Chief of the Dominion of Canada. Canada was removed from colonial control by the Colonial Office of the Crown in Chancery, which removed the statutory power of the Clerk in Chancery to issue any more letters patent for the office of Canada's Governor-General. Prime Minister R.B. Bennett, on the 10th day of August 1935, by the command of His Majesty, an heir and successor to Queen Victoria, despite this heir and successor having been removed from the British North America Act of 1867, by the repeal of Section 2 of the said Statute Law Revision Act of 1893, and with the power of the Crown remaining in the Chancery in the United Kingdom, did thereby commit fraud against the Canadian people by signing a commission appointing the Right Honourable Lord Tweedsmuir to be Governor-General and Commander-in-Chief of our Dominion of Canada, with a continuance of all the powers and privileges of that office. Additionally, please understand that all public officials in Canada are in grave danger as the people of Canada become aware of the crimes committed against them by their government and the government officials. It is little wonder there is so much security at courthouses these days. These people know that the day of reckoning is at hand. The least that we can expect to happen is that charges will be brought against all these people in due course. CCRA is a privatized criminal organization reporting directly to another NGO or non-governmental organization known as the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, who in turn receives its orders from the BAC, that is, the British American Commonwealth, who in turn receives its orders from the oligarchy, possibly with a few other intercessors along the way. CCRA is, therefore, another foreign criminal organization, and I, for one, refuse to comply with orders from such an organization. What can you expect if you take these issues to court? The issues of the unlawfulness, the lack of constitutional support, that is, for the Income Tax Act of Canada, the lack of constitutional support for provincial income taxes being transferred to the federal government, the issues concerning the banks controlling our money and issuing fiat currency out of nothing and enslaving us, and the fact that the government is an unlawful criminal organization, well, you can expect to lose. It's unfortunate, but that is the way it is. However, we have studied their laws and have found a way to defeat them without ever having to go to court. Here is why you will lose in court. The Supreme Court of Canada said in Attorney General versus the Law Society of British Columbia, 1982, there is, however, another aspect to this issue. The provincial superior courts have always occupied a position of prime importance in the constitutional pattern of this country. They are the descendants of the royal courts of justice as courts of general jurisdiction. They cross the dividing line, as it were, in the federal-provincial scheme of division of jurisdiction, being organized by the provinces under Section 92, Sub 14 of the Constitution Act, and are presided over by judges appointed and paid by the federal government. Your opponent, paid by the federal government, the Crown Attorney, paid by the federal government, the court staff, paid by either the provincial or federal governments, depending on the level of the court, the judge, paid by the federal or provincial governments, again depending on the level of court. You may be able to see why presenting the truth will not matter. Their job is to convict you, and justice does not matter. The only thing that matters is their paychecks. In a recent trial of a client of mine, who was convicted of failure to produce books and records, I had this to say to the judge: I had anticipated that I would be denied the right to represent him, so I had myself placed on the board of directors, thereby giving me the right to speak for the corporation. This is what I had to say. When we last appeared before you, I reminded you of your conflict of interest, a conflict that I feared would place you in a position where bias was unavoidable. This conflict of interest centers around the fact that you are appointed by the provincial government and paid from the Ontario Consolidated Revenue Fund, a fund that receives at least some of its revenue from the administrative and collection activities under the Income Tax Act of Canada, the very act that is at issue in this case. On page 82 of the transcript of these proceedings, the Crown asks, and I quote, "Are we to conclude, then, we cannot find a judicial appointment in the Dominion of Canada that can process these?" And what he was referring to, by the way, was charges under the Income Tax Act of Canada. The answer is a resounding yes. That is exactly what we are to conclude. Under the present system of appointment and remuneration by the federal and provincial governments, with payments of salaries and expenses from revenues generated at least in part by the Income Tax Act of Canada, it is obvious there exists a conflict of interest that leads any informed observer to conclude that there exists on the part of any accused, under provisions of the Act, a reasonable apprehension of bias. On the same page, page 82, the Crown further states, "There were several provincial court judges in Toronto that raised the issue, and it is totally without merit." If the judges themselves raised the issue, it obviously could not be totally without merit. Further, the case in question is Valenti versus the Queen of 1986. In this case, the court was not even considering the onerous situation where a judge is a trier of facts and attempting to administer justice under the Income Tax Act, a statute which raises revenue from which their own salaries are paid. At pages 82 to 83 of the transcript of these proceedings, Your Honour states that, "I have been completely open-minded on the issue and am prepared to be persuaded by argument of either counsel, and there is no one here biased any more than there would be in any other judge at any superior court level." We take very little comfort from this statement, which should certainly not dispel our reasonable apprehension of bias. It is no different than saying, "I am no more biased towards Canadians than any other Canadian would be." The conflict is obvious and irrefutable, involving the Income Tax Act issue. As in the case before this court today, it is not you or your character that are at issue, it is the undeniable pressure that you are under to administratively deal with income tax matters. However, even as I brought this conflict to your attention and expressed our reasonable apprehension of bias, you ruled that you could be unbiased and would be hearing the case. I have no doubt that you can be unbiased. However, if you do render a truly unbiased decision, then your future on the bench will be in considerable jeopardy from those very individuals who appointed you in the first place. You then proceeded, at the coaching and urging via hand signals from the Crown, to not only demonstrate your overwhelming bias, but unequivocally deny us our rights and my client the representation of his choice. To punish us in any way for being legally illiterate is analogous to punishing someone who comes to your court illiterate, period, in the common vernacular of being unable to read and comprehend, and is punished for being so. In 1996, the John Howard Society urged the Canadian judiciary to increase public confidence in the judicial system by not punishing people for being untrained in court procedures. It in fact may well be a breach of fundamental justice. I have contemplated making application to the Superior Court for an order of mandamus. I have contemplated filing a complaint with the Attorney General. I have even contemplated charging you with obstruction of justice. In the end, however, I have decided to see this process through and determine if you will, when the chips are down, administer justice as it is your sworn duty to do. In order to have some of our key evidence entered on the record as exhibits, I was forced to resort to having myself sworn as a witness and consequently subjected to the irrational, provocative, and personalized attacks of the Crown. This was all necessary because you were committed to denying us the ability to provide full answer in defense. At times, you yourself asked some alarmingly revealing questions, such as what my authority was for asking questions of my public servant. Although you did not word it exactly that way, it is exactly what you meant. Those are quotes from what I said to the judge in a court case not that long ago. And I said a lot of other things, of course, but she ruled against us because it does not matter what the truth is. I even presented some of the court cases that I've quoted from in this presentation. It did not matter. It is very evident that these judges are biased. Even after this admonition, the judge, in an 11-minute judgment, found my client guilty. We had many other issues, but I just want you all to understand that this obvious bias has been pointedly brought to the court's attention, and it has no effect. They continue to administer public policy, that is the government's agenda, at the expense of justice and truth. We must remember that there is no constitution in Canada for a variety of reasons, the main one being that it has been suspended by the introduction and adherence to the Bills of Exchange Act. When you enter a court, you are under Roman law and in an admiralty jurisdiction, meaning you are guilty until you are proven innocent, and the law is what the judge says it is. However, it is not good enough to sit back and allow someone else to become educated and to take the action necessary to protect you. You must do it yourself. Otherwise you will be like the German citizen Müller, who wrote after the Second World War. I watched as they came for the communist, and since I was not a communist, I stood by and did nothing. I watched as they came for the Jew, and since I was not a Jew, I stood by and did nothing. I watched as they came for my neighbor, and still I stood by and did nothing. Then one day they came for me, and suddenly I realized there was no one left to do anything. I would now like to just touch upon one of the cases, the only case really of any significance that the federal government uses in any situation that is brought before the courts, challenging the constitutionality of income tax, which we have recently done, and we do not know the results yet because we haven't got to trial. And it's the Karen case. And I'd like to just mention that the Karen case is not really law, because it's the only case of any relevance that they use. I will deal with it, however. This decision was also made by the Privy Council, the highest court of appeal in Canada at the time, that is 1924. This court was abandoned in 1949 in favor of the Supreme Court of Canada being the highest appeal court in Canada. The Privy Council in the Karen v. King case of 1924, which was an appeal from the Supreme Court of Canada, the court appeared to have been under pressure to satisfy the need for revenues by the Government of Canada as a result of Canada's immense efforts in supporting the British government in the First World War of 1914-18. At least this is what the federal government touted as their justification in its argument at the time. Time has given us a much different picture on this claim. We now know that the real reason for the national debt is the fact that the federal government gave its money creation powers to the private chartered banks in 1913, and from that time borrowed itself into debt, being the only way they could raise revenues other than indirect taxation. Using this deceitful reason, the federal government implemented the controversial Income Tax Act of 1917. However, the public and the Privy Council ate it, hook, line, and sinker. It was for this reason that the Privy Council made the decision it made in the Karen case. It not only reversed itself from its numerous previous decisions on this subject, but in order to do so it broke one of the cardinal rules of statute interpretation. It added words to the Constitution. The court added the words "for Dominion purposes" in 3 places in the official court report, thus justifying the Government of Canada's right to continue imposing direct income taxation within a province. Regardless of the rationale used by the court to justify its decision, it was an irrational and unlawful decision. The court, by adding words not found in our so-called Constitution, simply violated the rules of statute interpretation and did something that they were simply not permitted to do, and that is make law. Additionally, the Supreme Court of Canada in the Lord Nelson Hotel case returned to reality when rendering its decision in 1951, and once again recognized the divisions of power and the watertight compartments, quote-unquote, thereof. The court even went so far as to quote from one of the decisions of the Privy Council that we use, namely the Bank of Toronto v. Lamb of 1887, when it said, "Their lordships adhere to that view, and held that, as regards direct taxation within the province to raise revenue for provincial purposes, that subject falls wholly within the jurisdiction of the provincial legislatures." I have provided overwhelming authoritative proof that income tax is currently structured in all provinces except Quebec is totally unlawful, and in accordance with subsection 52(1) of Schedule B of the Constitution Act, the Income Tax Act of Canada is of no force or effect, since it contravenes the Constitution Act. However, I would like to say that the decision does exist, and it is a decision that is different from the previous decisions of the Privy Council on this issue. Therefore, I would like to reference two legal maxims that will put this decision in perspective. The first is this. The Karen case did not overturn or even consider the Bank of Toronto versus Lamb or the Citizens Insurance Company versus Parsons cases in its decision. These effectively violate the legal maxim res judica pro verite, which means, until reversed, a judicial decision is conclusive and its truth may not be contradicted. The Karen case did not overturn the previous two decisions. The previous two decisions remain law and are binding upon any lower court, which means basically any court in Canada. The second is that the Karen case did not follow precedent or case law. The legal maxim violated in this instance is the maxim of stare decisis, the principle by which a precedent or decision of one court binds courts lower in the judicial hierarchy. Thus, the Karen case is not valid law for the reasons that it used words not in the Constitution when making its decision, and it violated two legal maxims by ignoring its own decisions in 6 previous cases on this issue and failed to overturn them, meaning that the Bank of Toronto and the Citizens Insurance cases are still law in Canada today. This, coupled with the Supreme Court of Canada's reference to the Bank of Toronto case in its 1951 decision in the Lord Nelson Hotel case, proves conclusively that the two decisions that we rely upon are still law, the Lord Nelson Hotel decision being made some 27 years after the Karen decision. Of course, I would like to take this opportunity to point out once again that Canada does not have a constitution. As proof, let's look at two different dictionary definitions of the word constitution. Osborne's Concise Law Dictionary states this: 1. Those laws, institutions, and customs which combine to create a system of government to which the community regulated by those laws accedes, and 2. The written document embodying those laws. Black's Law Dictionary defines constitution as this: the organic and fundamental law of a nation or state, which may be written or unwritten, establishing the character and conception of its government, laying the basic principles to which its internal life is to be conformed, organizing the government, and regulating, distributing, and limiting the functions of its different departments, and prescribing the extent and manner of the exercise of sovereign powers. A character of government deriving its whole authority from the governed, the written instrument agreed upon by the people of the Union. I don't know about you, but I have never been asked to vote on or have any input into our so-called Constitution. I would like to point out here that not only do we not have a Constitution, the Act of the Imperial Parliament of England that Trudeau so deceitfully repatriated and called a Constitution is being routinely violated by the federal government. The federal government has intruded upon provincial government powers in areas of taxation, subsection 92(2), property and civil rights, section 92, subsection 13, with the gun law as only one example, health care, section 92.7, with the National Health Care Natural Resources under section 92A with the National Energy Program, and the list goes on. Join us in our efforts. Support us by becoming a member of We the People of Canada organization by visiting our website at wethepeopleofcanada.com. Membership is free. Our purpose is to bring the people of Canada together in an effort to bring about the changes necessary to save our government and sever the chains of bondage that bind us to the international bankers. The present debauched monetary system being fiat currency created out of nothing by the private banks, the only purpose of which is to steal our wealth and enslave us all. What we have learned about the system of today is that they have managed to accomplish the prophecy by creating a mirror image of us all, and have, through several of the millions of laws the government has created, made merchandise out of us all. We are the collateral for the national debt. Our birth certificates are bought and sold, and our labor is hypothecated for the worthless pieces of paper currency that has enslaved us all. If you do not believe what I say, simply write your name in the manner that it was given to you by your parents. Your name is written with each name beginning with a capital letter followed by lowercase letters. This is the correct way and the way we were all taught in school. This is also supported by the Canadian Styles Manual, a government publication. Now look at the name on the province's driver's license. Who is that? It certainly cannot be you. What has happened is that the government has created a mirror image of you, and as such, they have taken control of you because you admit to being that legal fiction, the all-capital name, or some other variation of your real name. I have just brought this to your attention to let you know and to understand that something is going on and that we have figured it out. We now use their laws to our advantage. This can be accomplished by you as well. I leave you with this one very important thought about taxes and the debauched monetary system that we have today in Canada and all other countries of the world with the exception of the Islamic world. Taxes provide us with nothing. All taxes are used to return the worthless paper currency back to the banks who created it. Once we cut through the smoke and mirrors and get by the idea that government needs money to provide us with roads and health care and pay interest on the national debt, we come to the realization that taxes are simply a means of stealing our wealth and enslaving us all. Proof of this is contained in an understanding of this next statement. I said it earlier, but it bears repeating. The country and all its natural resources belong to the people. The government is our servant and our trustee. The government, being our trustee and manager of our natural resources, means that the government has all of our wealth, and therefore all of our money. It is all under their control as trustees. The government has been managing our natural resources for about 150 years now. When are they going to send us our money? You see, instead of us having to pay the government anything, they should be paying us each and every year, once they have used the amount that is necessary to provide the services that we have authorized them to provide to us. Since we have not received our wealth or money, then I would have to presume that someone has stolen mine. What do you think has happened to yours? I would hope that at this point you now realize that the Income Tax Act of Canada is an unlawful act, having no constitutional support. In fact, being ultra vires the powers of the federal government given to it by the Constitution. Additionally, the income tax of all 9 provinces, that is, except the province of Quebec, is also unlawful in accordance with the Supreme Court of Canada ruling of 1950 in the Lord Nelson Hotel case, in which it stated that the powers of one level of government could not be transferred to the other. Therefore, since the federal government collects the provincial taxes in all 9 provinces other than Quebec, that makes it also unlawful. In addition to that, I hope you understand now that income tax, all other taxes, the court fines, license fees, speeding tickets, offense fines of every sort in this country are for the benefit of the banks. It is simply to extract money from our society and return it to its creator, the banks. That is the true prime purpose of taxation and all these other things that we've just talked about. We need to cut through the smoke and mirrors, however, to get to that. We first initially think about income tax as being a servicing mechanism for the national debt, when we get to the truth at least, but beyond that truth is the fact that taxes are really just to take money out of our society, and the money itself is a method by which the international bankers steal our wealth and our freedom. And finally, I hope you understand that the Government of Canada is an unlawful criminal organization because it has no lawful authority to exist. Canada has no constitution because a constitution is a written document establishing and limiting the powers of government and is written and ratified by the people of the nation, which has never happened in Canada in our history. I would like to just read a quote to you from a former president of the United States, about money. And it says this: "Whosoever controls the volume of money in any country is absolute master of all industry and commerce." And when you realize that the entire system is very easily controlled one way or another by a few powerful men at the top, you will not have to be told how periods of inflation and depression originate. That was a quote by James Garfield, July the 2nd, 1881, and within a few weeks of making that statement he was assassinated. We have to realize the awesome power and wealth of these international bankers and how they control us, and we must come together to do something about it. We individually can do nothing, but together we have all of the power.
This is a quote from the Magna Carta Canada, drafted by Eldon Warman. "We Canadians have been without lawful federal and provincial governments since 1931. We have had an imposter monarch and monarchy imposed upon us since 1931, while the Crown of the City of London has surreptitiously put us into deeper bondage as a subservient colony, replacing the British Crown as our colonial ruler. We have no lawfully established constitutions for our provincial governments, nor for our federal government. The so-called Constitution Act of 1982 is an absolute hoax and fraud. The fact that it was not ratified by the Canadian people and by the inclusion of the notwithstanding clause totally negates it as a constitution or as the supreme law of Canada. We have had these unlawful federal and provincial governments encumber our country and our natural wealth with massive debt based upon counterfeit money borrowed from foreign bankers. We have had admiralty law imposed upon us by massive fraud of this government, through unlawful and ultra-virus legislation, licensing schemes, and unlawful judicial process. We have been totally deprived of our common law rights, those rights being converted unlawfully to privilege only for those willing to submit to slavery, subservience, and oppression. Judges use legal fraud and deception to entrap Canadians into their foreign maritime admiralty jurisdictions where there are no rights recognized. We Canadians are having our lives, careers, and families destroyed by the outlaw band of thugs, the CCRA, while the Canadian justice system maintains a blind eye to this piracy.